My name is Elizabeth Robson,
And I'm Kai Sanburn.
and we're here to talk about the Rights of the Salish Sea campaign in San Juan County, Washington. So Kai, you're the one who started this whole crazy effort going, so I wanted to hear your story of how you learned about the rights of nature and what inspired you to start this.
Okay, well, I'll start back when I turned 60 and I decided to take a trip around the country. First on Greyhound bus, and then I joined a walk for climate action. This walk was going from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., and they did walk 8 months. I joined them for 10 weeks. And during that time, I walked a little bit through Arizona and New Mexico, and then rejoined them when they walked Indiana to Washington, D.C. And what we learned, what people experience is all across the country, people were noticing changes that they may not attribute directly to climate change, but that they saw things happening that were disturbing to them. Soils in Iowa that were infertile, droughts here and there. In Illinois and Ohio and into Pennsylvania, which is a kind of core frack country, we walked in and out of communities that had been literally turned upside down by fracking. And as people learned more and more about what it meant for the safety of their water, the just the costs that were associated with fracking to their communities. And those communities rose up, and I met one man who went to 83 consecutive town council meetings trying to keep fracking out of Youngstown, I think was where he was. Other communities, they were finding strange cancers. There was a man whose farm he'd owned for some 30-odd years. And unbeknownst to him, the mineral rights underneath it had been sold in the 1940s. And one day a fracking company, oil man is what they called them, came and presented them with their plan to drop not one but two frack wells on his farm. He could do nothing about it. The frack wells went in. There was a spill of wastewater from the fracking operation into his pond. The Department of Ecology said this was not a concern, don't worry about it. So he continued to keep his cows there, and the next year, half of them were stillborn. Many of them with sort of bizarre deformities. And at that point, the Department of Ecology said, well, actually, don't drink out of that pond. He pretty soon thereafter developed an aggressive form of, I believe, brain cancer and died. And we arrived in that community shortly after he had died. So what we saw was that communities, despite their best efforts, were not able to protect their air and water, which, if you think about it, is terrifying. If people they're not doing this to make money. They're not doing this because there's any advantage to them other than the security that their air and water is clean and that their children will have a livable future. But they found they couldn't do that. At around that time, we had the opportunity to listen in on a conversation led by a man named Thomas Lindsay with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and he described a movement that's called Community Rights Movement, and they had found success working with, interestingly, very conservative communities who were trying to keep out, for a hog farm or sludge deposit from their community, and really felt that as Americans that was their right. They believed in their hearts that as a democracy we have the power to make some determination about what happens to our communities rather than corporations coming in and making those decisions for us. So that community was able, against all odds, to fight this using a community rights framework, the right to clean air, clean water, because and they wouldn't have had to go that route, but for the utter failure of the regulatory system that had permitted this project and continued to permit these life-altering projects. So I started following CELDEF, that organization, thinking it had really resonated with me. Came back to here, to the San Juan Islands, that has been my home for some 25 years or so. And I continued to pay attention to what was happening in the community rights movement and started to hear more and more about the rights of nature. The rights of nature basically asserts that natural entities have the right to survive, thrive, and regenerate their life cycles. It is a very basic right. It's not the right to sue someone for cutting down a tree. It's not the right to take away any of my rights or your rights. It is simply that the ecosystem and natural entities have the right to survive and thrive. And that, again, hit a deep chord for me. And so I scraped my pennies together and attended the International Symposium in New Orleans on the rights of nature. And it was there that I heard someone speaking from Ecuador, where they had put the rights of nature into their constitution. And there was someone from Australia who spoke about some of the work they were doing, some woman from Sweden. There was someone from several of the tribes, the Hunkpapa and the Ponca, the Ponca Nation in Oklahoma. Casey Camp Hornick spoke there really eloquently about how the rights of nature resonated with indigenous wisdom and the indigenous relationship to the land, recognizing it's a Western legal framework, but that it is the best we've got to link those two. Everything I heard moved me deeper and deeper into believing that this is what we must do, understanding it's a long process, that we will not change laws overnight, that people will be baffling for some people, but that in a way, the way I've come to see it, since that was probably 3 years ago, I have come to see it as a way for us to repair the break that Western culture had with nature, however many centuries ago, and how that break with nature, where we see nature as in service to human needs, not just needs, but greeds. If it was just to meet our needs, if we could pull back from needing more and more and live within the limits of our natural systems, we wouldn't be in trouble. But we have not been able to do that. And the engine of our economy and our kind of the way we see ourselves is that of growth. And so we continue to move out and beyond the limits of what can be sustained by the planet. So my sense is if we can go back and bring ourselves back into alignment with nature, to see ourselves as part of the natural world rather than dominant, then we have the possibility to change the way we impact the world we live in. And additionally, we have the possibility of regaining a sense of belonging that I think is missing for so many people.
Yeah, definitely. So you came back from that symposium, and I remember talking to you when you came back and how excited you were about the rights of nature concept. And that's kind of when we got this idea of community rights San Juan Islands going. So can you talk a little bit about the organization and the campaign and how everything is evolving?
Yeah, so I think that was with the transitions group we were part of. There was a group of us meeting to look at how we move into this, clearly as climate chaos was kind of coming around, what we could do. At the time, there was the Trans Mountain Pipeline fight up in Vancouver. There was the fish farm chaos and crises with the fish spill. There was since then the LNG facility. There was the coal terminal at Cherry Point. So I attended a lot of these protests, and everywhere I went, everyone was sort of focused on their fight. We have to stop this pipeline, this coal terminal. And I looked at it and I felt like, this is all the same fight. And if we could put all of our energy under one umbrella, that we look at the ecosystem of the Salish Sea as a whole, and that our job in that whole is to protect what we can every which way that we can protect it, that we might be able to magnify each other's efforts. And, that you really have to protect the whole, not just this part here and that part here. So it seemed we started playing around with, a rights for the Salish Sea, which was a really broad, really big umbrella. And we talked about, I think, that, do we do the rights of a single species? Or do we do, how do we frame it? And through many conversations, I think we came to recognize that what we need to do is protect the ecosystem as a whole, that we need to start thinking in terms of whole systems rather than pieces that appeal to us because they're charismatic, while we disregard actually what happens to the eelgrass or other parts of that ecosystem that they are utterly dependent on. So that was 2 years ago, and a core group of us, a valiant, rugged, persistent group of people,
Persistent, yes,
has been meeting for the last 2 years, every 2 weeks, which is impressive. And through that time, we've learned a lot. We have come to, question the concept of rights. We have come to understand different ways of seeing things that, that we didn't, that when we came into this, we were a little naive to.
Yeah, for sure.
So we continue to wander down that path, taking 2 steps forward and half a step back. And we're sort of tilting at a windmill because it is a big, it's the Western legal system. There are the forces that keep that in place are massive, and we are small. But our feeling all along has been that the conversations that we have along the way are key to what we're doing. And I think, if I can speak for the group, I think all of us, the reason we keep coming to these meetings is that we find deeper meaning in the way we live in the world, because as we deepen our understanding about what it would actually mean to recognize the rights of the ecosystems and the natural entities around us. So, it is not a fight against some singular bad guy. It really is about changing the way we think. So we hope to get get an initiative on the ballot. We would hope to get that passed. But what we know is that the deepest value is that we as a community engage discussions about how we change the way we live with the world around us.
Yeah.
Is that yours?
Definitely, yes. And I think about how much my thinking has changed over the past 2 years, participating in this process and learning about what other countries have done, what other communities have done, and also, like you said, thinking differently about our relationships with the natural world and learning about all of the dangers that the Salish Sea faces, the obvious ones as well as the not so obvious ones. And then I don't know if you saw in the report that came out just recently talking about the goals that we had for Puget Sound, that we set 15,
Puget
20
Sound Partnership report.
Yes. And the utter failure of all the billions of dollars that we have spent. So it speaks to me even more strongly that we desperately need a shift in thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is why I keep coming to the meetings.
Yeah. And I think in all honesty, a lot of the factors that are impacting the health of our ecosystems are kind of locked in to some degree because of the bigger issues. But still, it is essential to do what we can and to change our relationship. And one of the experiences I've had is, I think there are people, when you describe it, it's like a missing puzzle piece. They're like, oh, this makes so much sense. I had a little girl, she's probably 15, in a class when I was talking about it, and she said, all of a sudden, she stood up and her eyes got really bright, and she said, oh, this just makes so much sense. And I think we're born into this world understanding that our dog can talk to us, that you can sit in the trees and, there are fairies or spirits. But we kind of teach that out our culture has taught us to deny that. And in a way, it's kind of allowing ourselves to reclaim that, And so I think that it's kind of a coming home.
Yeah, I love that.
In a way.
Yeah. So what do we want people to do in order to, if they feel moved, contribute to the rights of the Salish Sea?
Oh, come to our meetings. We serve snacks.
We do. Good snacks.
Bread and Roses. It's a Bread and Roses kind of organization. Well, I think researching rights of nature movements around the world. And to be truly honest, there are many places that have instituted rights of nature laws in some form or another, but they are challenged. They don't transform things overnight. Ecuador, has so many political instabilities, but the courts are getting used to the idea of rights of nature. They are beginning to understand that it is a right that needs to be defended, and doing that in smaller instances, because when money and power come, even our most well-established laws don't really stand up to money and power. So for a new law to do that is, it's still a ways out. But courts are becoming more familiar with that language. It is a kind of legal process is being built. So I think learning about some of the other places that this is happening is important. And also, just when you go on a walk, imagine that natural community as your community, as people may already do this, but just imagine it welcoming you home. Imagine that you are not the owner of that forest. You are not, the sunbather on that beach. You are part of that community, and you are welcomed there. And if you treat it with respect, then we are, we treat each other with respect. What goes around comes around. And I think that's one of the most powerful things people can do, is try to feel into what it would mean.
Well, thank you, Kai.
Thank you, Beth, as always.